Ahoy, this is Michaela from Team Retro, where we like retro games and the devices that bring them to us. And in this video, we're turning our attention back to the Ayn Loki. So I've had the Ayn Loki for almost 2 months now, about a month and a half, and I have to say that this little device has actually charmed me considering how long I've had to wait for it. And this device has had quite a controversial history. It got delayed, the whole frame and hardware of the device was completely changed, and then certain models of Loki were actually not produced because of lack of interest. However, this video is going to be what my buddy Shem from Retro Breeze calls a redemption story. We're going to do an in-depth review of the Loki 6600U model, and I'm going to talk about how I've been using this device over the past month and a half, some of the strengths that make this device an absolute beast, and some of its shortcomings as well. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and this is going to be a long video, so let's dive in and let's get to work. Now, back at the end of July when I first got this device, I did do a first impressions video, and there are a lot of things that I cover in that video, like specs, that I'm not going to rehash here. So I'm going to throw a card up and put that video in the description if you are interested in looking at it. But I want to start this video by doing a quick check of the internals of the device, because I did ultimately end up getting a 1TB hard drive to upgrade from the 256 that comes with this unit. And the unit itself was fairly simple to open up. There's 4 screws in the back, and then use a guitar pick to gently pry the back of the unit off. However, to get to the hard drive, you do need to disconnect and remove the cooling fan, which if you followed my channel in the past, you know I have a storied past with breaking cooling fans and their connections. But thankfully, I didn't have to actually disconnect the fan. I just needed to remove a small piece of tape that connects the fan to the radiator at the top. And then I was simply able to move the fan aside, and I was able to access the hard drive slot. And as you could see in the footage here, even though it's sped up, this unit takes a 2242 M.2 hard drive. So I was able to get a 1TB Sabrent Rocket, which is my go-to for hard drive replacements, and it cost me about $100 on Amazon. I will leave a non-affiliate link to that hard drive if you are interested in swapping out the one on your Loki. Just make sure to check which Loki model you actually have, because the hard drive might be different depending on which model of Loki you have. Just remember that this video is for educational purposes only, and I'm not responsible if you break your unit. And the other thing I wanted to do is I wanted to try a Windows X Lite build, because I wanted to see if it would make the unit run a little bit more efficiently. And I do have to say that this did a pretty decent job getting rid of all of the bloat that typically comes with a Windows 11 build, and it did make it a little bit more efficient. But then I also had to go through the trouble of reinstalling all the drivers. And although this build claims to be more lightweight and take up less space on the disk, there is still the issue of if you need to run Windows updates, you're still going to end up with a whole bunch of space on your hard drive that's just taken up by updates and Windows. Plus, I had to buy a new product key because it wouldn't take the product key that came with the device. So this is not something that I would wholly recommend as of this recording. I'd say you're better off if you want to upgrade the hard drive, just cloning or switching to a regular Windows 11 install and just use your product key that came with the Loki. Or if you're okay with the amount of storage that you have, just use a micro SD card to supplement your storage and don't bother opening up the system at all. It's really up to you how you want to proceed with your unit. I just wanted to show you what is actually possible if you want to upgrade this unit. At time of recording, I am rocking the 1TB hard drive and a 512GB micro SD card, and that's providing me with enough storage for all the games I want on this device. So let's start with some things about this device that I like and some things that are a little bit on the annoying side. And I want to start by turning the device on and letting you hear the sound. Yes, that is the beeping noise you hear when you turn the device on. And I've gotten kind of used to it now, but I'm going to be honest, when I first got the device and first started using it, that sound was really triggering. I can't explain why, it just sounds very old-fashioned and it just hits a certain part of the brain that drives me nuts. And it's not a deal breaker for me by any way, shape, or form, but it is something that I had to get used to and deal with. Considering how pleasant the Steam Deck's turn-on noise is, AYN could have done much better there. However, a positive is I can use the Steam Big Picture front end here, and this device is going to very closely resemble the experience that I have with my Steam Deck, and that's because of one great feature. The button on the bottom under the D-pad functions as an Xbox button when you are in controller mode, which means that you can get the most out of Steam Big Picture mode. And all of the benefits that go with it, like being able to quit out of a game, being able to see your battery life, and you can even power off the system from here, so you technically never need to see the Windows desktop once you have this all set up and ready to go. Now, the next small complaint I want to bring up is the volume up and down buttons. They just seem very mushy and just kind of sink into the device in order to trigger, so I really have to push down on them to get any sort of reaction, and sometimes I feel that when I go to adjust the volume, the button is going to get lost in the unit. And considering every other x86 device I own has very clicky, almost dome switch style buttons for volume controls, it's very jarring to have this very mushy, solitary button that does work, but just doesn't feel quite right. It is a modern complaint because how often am I adjusting the volume while playing? But nevertheless, it is something that bothers me a little bit. Taking a look at the Loki Control Center, this has had quite an update since my last video, and a lot of the controls are the same, but you'll notice that now you can actually change the refresh rate of the screen, and you can also set it to a 4:3 aspect ratio if you are using this device strictly for emulation. And even though this device is capable of outputting at 1080p, I found that a 720p at 60 Hz resolution is kind of the sweet spot, and then you can adjust the refresh rate from there for certain games. You'll notice next to the fan curve is now an option to turn on an FPS limiter, and I tend to turn this on for more heavy PC games so that I can limit the frame rate to 40 frames per second and still get a good experience while getting a little bit more energy out of the device. Now, the lighting section has changed as well. They got rid of some of the reactive lighting samples. I guess they weren't working all that great. So now we just have an auto and we have a manual, and these LEDs are still very bright, so I like to keep it at 20%, and I usually stick with green for the color. Now let's click this settings icon because a lot of features actually moved to this section. You can actually choose to update your control center here, but you can also launch this on startup now, which was one of my biggest concerns about this unit when I did my first look, and I'm really glad to see that they fixed that. They also changed the volume and brightness controls to this settings area, as well as the opacity of the LCC itself. And you could still create a custom fan curve, as well as go with an auto and a manual setup. So overall, I will say that I am very happy with these changes to Loki Control Center, and it has been a game changer for me with this device. Now let's take a look at some of the shortcuts that the Loki gives you to navigate the Windows operating system. The first one is if you press start and select at the same time, it will bring up your task manager if you need to kill unresponsive apps. If you hold the start button, you will get the on-screen keyboard. Now, I did use a script called Replace OSK that I will leave in the description because I feel that this is a much better keyboard compared to what typically comes up. I ran the same script back when I had the Win 600 because I feel that this keyboard is much better than the antiquated one that they give you. And it's still a Windows keyboard, so I'm confused why that option isn't available by default, but at least it's an easy fix. And like I said before, under the D-pad is our Xbox button, and then if you need to switch to mouse mode, you can hold the L1 and R1 buttons until you hear the Windows sound. And that will change your left joystick to a mouse. It will change the A button to left click, and it will change the B button to right click. So if you need to navigate folders or websites, this is going to be how you do it. And it takes a minute of getting used to, considering all these x86 devices have different ways of navigating Windows. But once you figure it out, it is very intuitive. Now, in mouse and keyboard mode, the Xbox button on the bottom changes to a Windows button and will pull up the Start menu when you press it. And the buttons in the back that are mapped to L3 and R3 will also gain some extra functionality. The left button in the back will change to a Show Desktop button, and the button on the right will change to Alt-Tab so you can navigate different programs. And so when I need to switch back to Steam Big Picture mode, I'll press the R1 and L1 button again, and I'll switch back to that controller mode, and I'll be able to navigate that interface once again. So I know that some of you fine viewers were going to want to see benchmarks, so I did run a CPU test on 3D Mark just to see what it would come up with. And I got a bunch of numbers, and I'm not sure what these numbers mean, but maybe they mean something to you. So here are the numbers that the 6600U chip was able to put out. Now, as I'm fairly new to benchmarking and I'm not quite sure what all of this means, I ran the exact same test on the ROG Ally because I felt that as far as these devices go, the Ally was going to be the Loki's biggest competitor as far as comfortability, size, and performance. And I wasn't surprised to see that indeed those numbers are bigger. So my interpretation is that the CPU on the ROG Ally is more powerful than the CPU in the AYN Loki, and hopefully these numbers will help you with your decision on which handheld you're looking to purchase. But For me, I'm going to tell you that they don't really matter because pretty much anything I threw at the Loki, it did seem able to handle very well. So let's get into some gameplay testing to show you exactly what I mean. So let's start with Mega Man Legacy Collection. Now, this game is running at an 8-watt TDP, but it really does seem to only be pulling about 5 watts because this game does not require a lot of energy to run. But it seems to be running at a stable 60 frames per second, and it is running very well. Now, this is through Steam at a 720p resolution, and we are running this game under its default settings. Another game that runs very well under default settings is WrestleQuest. Now, this game just came out a couple of weeks ago, so this is a 2023 release, and we are running it at an 8-watt TDP at a 720p resolution, and it looks great, and it plays great with some minor frame dips here and there to 58 frames per second. So if you are worried about maintaining that 60, you could put the TDP up to 10 watts, and that will alleviate your concerns. Now, this game is an RPG that actually is a throwback to 80s wrestling, and I didn't think I was going to like this game, but I'm actually having a great time with it. One of my favorite things to do on these retro handhelds is play pinball games, and I was very excited to hear that Pinball FX was going to be getting the Star Trek Next Generation pinball machine because it's already my go-to pinball machine on Android devices. However, I didn't realize how much juice the Pinball FX app actually needed. Here we are at low settings, and I had to jack this up to a 15-watt TDP to get it to work correctly. So it is beautiful to see this game running on this device. However, the amount of juice that this game requires does make me think that battery life is going to be an issue long term. And thankfully, I'm so bad at pinball games that I tend to give up after a couple of tries, so that battery life hasn't really hit me as hard as I'm saying. But there is more than just old school Star Trek. You can also access some great pinball machines that were created specifically for Zen Pinball, like this Marvel Avengers one here that I really feel I needed to showcase just because we are playing this on the AYN Loki. And although this pinball machine in particular is running at 52 frames per second, I don't seem to notice any slowdown or anything like that, so the pinball machine might just be programmed to run at that frame rate. And if you're familiar with me and my channel, then you know if I love a device enough, I have to find a way to get Final Fantasy XIV playing on it, and so I was able to do that here. I'm running it at a 10-watt TDP, and for this particular game, you can run it at 60 frames per second, and most of the time you will get a positive experience, But here, even on low settings during battles and in congested areas, it is very difficult to maintain that 60 frames per second. It does dip. So in a later segment, I'm going to show you what I did to alleviate this. But for those of you Final Fantasy XIV fans out there, I can proudly say that I'm finally in Endwalker content, and I finally lost my Sprout. Now let's try something that tends to run a little bit on the heavier side. We're going to play some Genshin Impact, and for this game, I actually put the FPS limiter on and set it to 40 Hertz. So we are playing at low settings at 40 frames per second. And even though this game could get higher on more powerful machines, it is running very well at low settings on this device, and it does still look very good, and it is worth playing on something like the Loki because now you have full controller support being a PC game, and you also have a fairly good experience as well. I would much rather play Genshin on a device like this than on an Android device. Now, for 90% of my emulation, I've been running through Emulation Station Desktop Edition, and most systems will do a very good job aggregating my ROM library right from here, and then I can set my emulators as well as my artwork right from this UI here. And so this gives me a nice aggregated list, and I can just boot up my games from here and they will boot right into the respective emulator that I choose. And I'm going to be doing a video in the future on how I set up EmuDeck for my specific emulation needs in the hopes that it will help you guys out as well. But for now, let's get into some emulation testing. We're going to start with PSP running PPSSPP on a 2x resolution, and most games here are going to run at a 10 watt TDP, and because we have a 16:9 screen, a lot of these games are going to look very good. I also wanted to take this opportunity to test out the D-pad for fighting games, and I found that 90% of the time I was able to get my combos off fairly well, and there was a small amount of time where I was not. So D-pad seems passable to me for fighting games. Now, unfortunately for Dolphin, I had to kick this up to a 15 watt TDP in order to get the games to even start up and run. I had a lot of issues running Paper Mario Thousand Year Door at anything below a 15 watt TDP, but once I got it running, you'll notice that the GPU and the CPU are only pulling about 7 or 8 watts, so battery life might still be okay for GameCube, but you definitely can't lower settings, otherwise games are just going to crash. But you'll see here that once we set that 15 watt TDP, our gameplay is nothing short of phenomenal at a 2x resolution. Using RPCS3, we are running PlayStation 3 games at a 2x resolution as well. However, we also need to maintain that 15 watt TDP in order to get decent performance. Now, this game here that we're testing is called Ragnarok Odyssey Ace. Now, Ragnarok Odyssey was an old school MMORPG, and this PS3 release was a way of taking that Ragnarok universe and combining it with the gameplay of a Monster Hunter game. And so this game plays very similarly to Monster Hunter, where you are in a home base or a home hub, and you take on missions to destroy certain monsters. And from there, you get loot and gold in order to upgrade your gear so that you can take on stronger monsters and do more difficult missions. This game was also an answer to Monster Hunter in the sense that it also was released on the PlayStation Vita and it had cross-save support, so you can play on the Vita, and then when you're home, you could go back to your PlayStation 3 and continue your gameplay there. And the game is designed to only run a maximum of 30 frames per second, and we have no problem maintaining that here. Now, you'll notice when I tested PSP, I did not do the God of War test, and that's because with this device, I don't need to, because we can skip straight to the God of War HD remasters that are on PlayStation 3. And you could see here, I'm playing God of War HD at a 15 watt TDP, and we are getting that full 60 frames per second. However, running at a 15 watt TDP will definitely take a toll on the battery because, as you could see, the CPU and the GPU are taking full advantage of those wattages. However, despite this, I still recommend you use these versions of the God of War games, specifically when you're playing Chains of Olympus and Ghosts of Sparta, because you will have your dodge controls mapped to the right stick instead of having to hold L1 and R1. However, for more lightweight games like X-Men Arcade, even though here I am running the game at a 15 watt TDP, the system is only pulling 8 watts from the CPU and the GPU. So you can probably get away with actually lowering this to a 10 watt TDP because this is a more lightweight PS3 game, and you'll probably get more battery life that way. But the fact that we are getting decent PS3 emulation on this device is a testament to its power, and this is not even the most powerful Loki you can get. You can still get the Loki Max, and you will get this performance and slightly better. And you can also do some lightweight Switch emulation on this device. Here we are playing Pokemon Brilliant Diamond, and we do unfortunately have to keep this at a 15 watt TDP. Now, I did notice something when I was playing this game because I took the opportunity to clean out my smudgy gym badges using the touchscreen, and I just happened to notice that on the bottom left of the device, the screen was actually getting pretty uncomfortably warm. And I honestly did not notice it until I tried using the touchscreen in this manner. And it may have something to do with the custom fan curve that I set up in my last Loki video. So if you do find that the system is getting hotter than you want it to be, you probably want to switch it back to that auto fan curve, even though it is going to make the device sound like a jet engine. And just a quick tip, you can also take a soft cloth and use that to clean your badges as well, and it will still recognize it as a touchscreen. So if you want a more authentic experience and you want to clean your badges and your screen at the same time, definitely get yourself a small cloth towel and you'll get a pretty authentic experience there. However, as gameplay itself is concerned, this is another game that maxes out at 30 frames per second. And we do get a couple of dips here and there, but for the most part, this game does run pretty smooth. And the advantage to me emulating this game as opposed to playing it on the Switch is I'm able to take advantage of a couple of mods called Faster Battles and Better Underground. And so it enhances my experience of the game as well as allows me to play on a better handheld with better joysticks, buttons, and build quality. However, let's shift focus to battery life in a segment that I'm going to call a day in the life. And this is going to be just how I gauged the battery on this particular device because I didn't want to run these massive battery tests where I keep the device on for 4 or 5 hours and then go back to check on it to see if the battery died. So instead, I just used the device normally and recorded the battery at the end of each session. And so right before bed, I played some Pokemon Brilliant Diamond through Yuzu, and when I finished my play session, I was about at 81% after about an hour of playtime. And for all of the games that I played, I kept them at a 10 watt TDP. At that point, I turned the system off and went to bed. And the next day, I wanted to play some Yu Gi Oh! Master Duel. And so, what I ended up doing was I turned it on and I needed to download about 6 gigabytes. So, I did that at work and I didn't actually touch the device. And so, while it downloaded the update, it did unfortunately drop the battery to about 61%, which was about a 20% difference just downloading a patch. And then when I got home, I played it again for another 2 hours on the couch and finally drained the battery in the middle of doing a deck build. Just as a quick side note, if you play Master Duel and you ever want to play with me or against me, please hit me up in the Steam Machine or the Retro Handhelds Discord. I would love to duel. After charging the device, I was back at 100%, and so I booted up Final Fantasy XIV, and I spent about 2 hours running Fates because I'm trying to get an epic weapon skin for my red mage, and unfortunately that does require a little bit of grinding, and I had some time after work before I had to pick up my foster son, so I figured why not. And that took me from 100 to, again, about 61% in those 2 hours of gameplay. And to better optimize this game, I dropped the refresh rate to 40 Hz. And then finally, I started up a new game that released just on Friday called Fae Farm. And this is a farming slash life sim slash mild combat game like Stardew Valley, where there is a little bit of magic. So as you progress through the game, you will get magical powers that will allow you to tend to your crops and grow things a lot quicker. And I found myself really enjoying my time with it, but unfortunately, I only got through about an hour and a half before the battery finally kicked. And this was at low settings at a 720p resolution at a 10-watt TDP. So it was as efficient as I felt I could get it. And so, based on these tests, depending on what you're running and what you're playing, you can probably average an hour and a half to potentially 4 hours battery life using the Ayn Loki. And that kind of rivals the Steam Deck as far as efficiency. It's not as good as the Steam Deck, but it's fairly close. And if you drop the TDP even lower to say like 5-watt TDP for NES and Game Boy games, you will probably get at least 5, if not 6 hours out of this device. Like everything else, it all depends on your use case and how much energy you are drawing. All right, let's start to wrap things up with my final thoughts. So, as far as the positives, the 6600U that comes in this specific model Loki is still very powerful, and pretty much everything I threw at it, granted, I didn't throw any Spider-Mans or God of Wars at it, it handled it pretty well. And the only thing that kept me from playing certain games was the amount of power that I was drawing from the unit itself. I would play something less powerful if I wanted to get more battery life out of the device, and if I just wanted to play something for the sake of playing it, I would take the risk drawing that extra power. I love that this device has a dedicated Xbox button. The battery seems very decent for a Windows x86, and the ergonomics are very passable. I can't say that I've had an uncomfortable experience using this device. And I didn't compare button size and thickness and weight and all that like I typically do, because there was just a lot to talk about when it came to the Loki, but I'm going to give just a quick synopsis in saying that this device is an interesting middle ground. It's not as light as an Ion Neo Air, but it's not as heavy as a Steam Deck. I would almost compare this to the ROG Ally as far as weight and ergonomics go, because the ROG Ally does manage to take a 7-inch screen device and just make it feel like a feather. And I would say that this wasn't quite a feather, but it wasn't quite a boulder either. Now let's talk about some of the negatives, and it was hard to find negatives, but I did find them. And we're going to start with the fan curves. If you leave it on auto, it sounds like a jet engine, but if you put a custom fan curve, the screen does get a little bit warm when you are actually taxing the device. The volume buttons on the top are fairly mushy and they are a little bit awkward to press. It's nothing like other devices that typically have a clicky volume button. And that 256 gigabyte drive is going to fill fast. Now, you can supplement that with micro SD card storage, but the fact that Windows takes up a lot of hard drive space on its own, that may compel you to want to upgrade the hard drive or try one of these custom Windows builds that allegedly doesn't take up as much space. And that leads to this being a little bit less of a plug and play device than you would typically want. Now you see that pricing and availability is also on the negatives list, so let's talk about that really quick. If you go on AYN's website, you'll notice that the prices for the Loki units have dropped pretty significantly, and you can get this specific model for $499, and they will ship it with 4PX. However, when you do go to order this from their website, they are still listing it as a pre-order, and they don't necessarily explain when these units are shipping. So you may have to wait a bit for these devices to actually ship out, and then if you're going to ship it with 4PX, you are probably looking at about a 2 to 4 week wait on top of that. And so if I'm wrong about that, please correct me in the comments section, but at time of recording, it does seem like it is going to be a little bit of a wait to get this device. And let's also keep in mind that you can get a 256 Steam Deck for just a little bit more. And so, while I really do recommend this device and I really do adore it, your decision to purchase this should stem from whether you want the device right now, or if the features that I've described in my 2 Loki videos are enough to make you want to wait for this to come in. And of course, that decision is going to ultimately be up to you, and hopefully everything that I've covered in this video will help guide you toward that decision. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you have a Loki and do you love it? Are you considering the 256 model over the Max model? And is this device worth the wait, or are you considering another option? And please feel free to continue the conversation in the Steam Machine and the Retro Handhelds Discord. That's where I tend to hang out in between videos. And I'm actually planning on writing a written review on the Retro Handhelds website to complement the 2 videos that I've published on the Loki. But that'll do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. And if this has helped you in any way, please be sure to like and subscribe. Until next time, bye for now, and don't stop believing.